and welcome to another episode of Guess That Record. I am your host, Jackson Reed. This is the show where we talk about music and try to figure out which album I pulled from my collection. As always, thanks to you, the listeners, for tuning in to another episode. It's time to introduce our next amazing guest. He's a British photographer who's been active since the 1960s. Focused largely on music, he's taken photos of some of the most legendary musicians in history, including the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, George Harrison, Elton John, and many more. I'm pleased to welcome Gered Mankowitz to Guess That Record. How are you doing, Gered?
I'm good. I'm fine, thank you. Nice to be with you.
Absolutely. And so you're just mentioning to me that you're in Cornwall, is that right?
That's right. Cornwall, southwest England.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's my home.
Mm-hmm. I haven't been to England yet, and every time I have an English guest on, I'm always like, it's like the number one place I want to go to. So, hope to get over there one day.
Yeah, well, you definitely should. I've been to Calgary, so I'm ahead of you.
Awesome. Yeah. I think I actually saw that on your website. You were doing like photography out in like Banff. Is that right?
Yes, I did. Yes, we went on it wasn't a photographic assignment. It was a holiday. My wife Julia and I, we went on a sort of a trek, not a trek, a journey from Calgary to Vancouver.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
That's a good drive. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, it's great to have you on the show, as you're the first photographer we've ever had on the podcast.
Oh,
And,
wow.
it's obviously amazing to be speaking with you, considering, your incredible career. And it's interesting because I think music and photography are very intertwined. So I think it's exciting to hear from someone who comes from the photography side of the music business.
Good. Well, I'm pleased you think that. I mean, I agree with you. I think photography and music are very intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And now I always like to start interviews by asking, what was the first album or the first song that got you into music? And I'd love to know what that is for you, but I also want to know what got you into photography.
Okay, so the music thing first. I think the first record I ever bought was Diana by Paul Anka.
Mm.
So I don't know quite when that was, 1957. And I think that I'd heard that and I liked that, so I bought that. And that was probably the beginning of my record collecting experience. And photography, well, so I always wanted to be in the theatre. I always imagined that I was going to be an actor or a director. And I love the theatre. And but I realized that I probably didn't have the talent, or maybe it was my father who realized I didn't have the talent and discouraged that. But I wanted to do something that was connected with show business, and being a photographer in music had tremendous appeal to me as a young man. I mean, I shot my first cover when I was about 17 for a jazz singer called Annie Ross, American singer called Annie Ross. And I realized then that this was a great place for me as a photographer, the music industry. And that's really how I got into it.
And so it kind of was like a conscious decision for you to sort of make music your subject as a photographer then.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it was conscious from the very outset of my career. I served an apprenticeship. I was an assistant to a fashion photographer for a short while, but it music fulfilled all my original ambitions about being a photographer. So I wanted to photograph people. I wanted to be in show business in some way. And the music industry at that time, we're talking 63, was bursting, exploding with young energy, young artists, young producers, and young photographers. And the whole that whole 60s explosion was so exciting, and it just seemed like a really natural and comfortable place for me to be.
Hmm. And, as you mentioned, yeah, like, being, I can't imagine what it would be like to be in, England in the 60s, because it just was such an exciting time. And I guess, like, yeah, you mentioned there what your first sort of, musician that you photographed, but like, how did you kind of get your foot in the door to start getting those assignments back then?
Well, okay, so I guess it started because I was photographing young actors, and two young actors came to me. They were still students at the Central Speech of Drama, Central School of Speech and Drama, and they were called Chad Stewart and Jeremy Clyde, and they also performed as a duo, Chad and Jeremy. And they asked me to photograph them at the coffee shop that they were performing in. And I did that. And I became very good friends with them very quickly. And they signed to a small independent record company called Ember Records. And Ember Records sort of took me in and started giving me other work, other assignments, including the Annie Ross cover. And then Chad and Jeremy made their first album called Yesterday's Gone, and I did the cover for that. And then things just took off. And it was really one door. You said foot in the door. Well, it was one door after another. So through Chad and Jeremy, I met Marianne Faithfull, who was promoting her first single, As Tears Go By. And I started photographing her. I just asked her. I said, "Can I photograph you?" And she said, "Yes, of course." And I said, "Great, I'll pick you up tomorrow morning, and we'll go and take some pictures." And she was managed by Andrew Loog Oldham, who managed the Stones
Mm,
as well. And he loved some pictures I did of Marianne, and so he asked me to photograph the Stones. And that's it,
okay. Yeah.
one door after another, and I'm suddenly photographing, one of the most important bands in the UK to become, one of the most important bands in the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really, I've come to realize that, yeah, entertainment in general, it's all about who you know. So yeah, that makes sense that it's just all about building those connections. And going right into some of your portfolio, it's like when I was doing the research for this interview, it's there's just so much great material to go through. So I kind of whittled it down to some highlights that I wanted to go over. And of course, you mentioned the Rolling Stones, and they're probably the band you're linked with the most, just looking through your career. And you did two album covers for them, including this one here, which is
Yeah.
Between the Buttons. Now I was reading that when you took this picture, the filter that you used was homemade. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. So while the band were recording that album, I would go to the studios and basically hang out and take photographs. And I was getting rather frustrated by the intrusive background that the recording studio presented, full of verticals and horizontal lines that just distracted. And so I made a filter out of glass and black card and Vaseline to try and blur the background and create a sort of circular area in the middle of the frame where I could focus on the subject, Brian, Mick, Keith, whatever. And that proved really successful, and I really liked it. And when we came up with the idea of taking the band out early in the morning after an all night recording session, I adapted the filter so that I could shoot the whole band outside using the same filtration technique.
Mm. Yeah, it's yeah, I always love reading about stuff like that. from, like the 60s, where you didn't have computers back then, so you really had to kind of think outside the box to get the desired effect. And it's same thing in music. I mean, they had to do crazy things with the tape and whatnot to get
Yeah.
certain effects that way.
Yes, I mean, I guess outside the box is the right expression. I mean, the thing is that we live in such a digital age now that anything analog seems ancient, and but for us, that was our world. There weren't any other options, so we were continuously experimenting. And for a young photographer who wasn't, I wasn't very good at learning from books and stuff like that. I would have to learn by my mistakes and trial and error. So I was continuously experimenting one way or the other.
Hmm. And while we're still on the topic of the Stones,
Mm.
I saw that they did bring you on tour with them, and it's interesting to sort of look at your portfolio, because I've noticed a lot that music photographers will, of course, do the portraits and the promotional shots and that sort of thing. But there's usually a ton of concert photography in there as well. But I've noticed that besides that tour with the Stones, you don't have a ton of concert photos in your portfolio. So, like, was that another, like, you prefer to shoot sort of the more controlled shots, or yeah, what was what's your take on concert
Well, absolutely.
photography, I
I
guess? Yeah.
mean, yeah, I was never very interested in photographing the concerts. It was never something that particularly appealed to me. But the primary reason for that was that in the 60s, the lighting was terrible.
Mm,
You know,
right.
bands didn't have their own lights, venues were very poorly equipped, so the lighting was always very bad. And photography, the essence of photography, the very fundamental photography, is about light and how you capture it. And I just was frustrated photographically by the live music experience. And I never felt any tremendous compulsion to do that. I went on tour with the Stones. How could I have resisted? What a wonderful opportunity. And it was an extraordinary experience, and I did get a lot of material out of it. But it was also very frustrating photographically. And I also realized that I wanted to do what I consider to be serious portrait photography. That was what I wanted to do. And I was happy to do recording studio photography. I was happy to take my subjects on location, but I wanted to control the session. I wanted it to be a collaboration between me and the subject. And, and after touring with the Stones in America, I did very little live stuff. And if I did, it was on specific projects. So for instance, I did shoot the Stones live again in '66, specifically for a record cover for the Got Live If You Want It album, which is all my work. So,
Mm,
but I found studio photography and working collaboratively with the subject in the studio or on location was far more rewarding, far more fulfilling, and far more interesting photographically. And so that's what I've always pursued.
right. Yeah. So just a preference there.
Yes, just
um, Now, I wanted to go over this photo here with Jimi Hendrix.
yeah,
So I was, that was something I was really excited to talk about, because I'm a musician and a guitar player myself. So, of course, Hendrix has been a huge influence. And the interesting thing with those pictures is that they've become quite iconic, but they didn't see the light of day for many years. So, what's the story behind that photo shoot?
well, the reality is that when I met Hendrix and I first saw him play, um, I was completely blown away, like anyone else would have been. And I thought that I wanted to photograph him. I wanted to treat him as a serious musician, and I wanted to treat him with dignity. And I felt that at that point in time, 1967, that the way to do it was to photograph him in black and white in a traditional, serious, proper portraiture style. And that's what I did. And Chaz Chandler, who was his producer and manager at the time, and who discovered him in New York and brought him over to the UK, he seemed to go along with that. He didn't raise any objections to that, and so that's what I did. And and I did the shoot. Everybody seemed very happy with the shoot. I did a second shoot with Jimmy and the band, and everybody seemed absolutely delighted. But when it came to the record covers, everybody wanted color, and I didn't have it. And so they went somewhere else. I don't know why they didn't come back to me and ask me to shoot some more in color, but they didn't. And so, although my pictures were used contemporaneously at, for instance, there are some quite famous photographs which you can find on Google, of Jimmy performing in Germany at a Polydor Records event, and in the background, Polydor, the record company, have blown up several of my pictures, huge, as a background to Jimmy. So they were used, but they were only used for perhaps 3 or 4 months, and because they were never on record covers, they just disappeared. And they didn't emerge again until my first exhibition, which was in 1981, and then I only included 2 shots of Jimmy, and then it was in 91 that they really came into their own, and I explored my archive fully and started making many more prints and doing some experimental stuff, and and then they started to become famous.
Right. Yeah, no, that's it, either way, it's interesting how, maybe at the time they weren't as appreciated, but then over time they became a very important part of your portfolio.
Yes, they're crucial. They're very important because partly because when people see them, they feel a connection with Jimi Hendrix, the human being, the man, and that extraordinary link that one has at the time of taking the picture um, communicates itself when to the viewer. And when I make big prints, particularly larger than life size, they overwhelm people. People are deeply moved by them, and it's a remarkable thing. A great privilege to have been able to do that.
This episode of Guess That Record is brought to you by Marvel Marketing. Marvel Marketing is an award-winning digital marketing company headquartered in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, working with clients in different industries from all over North America, including Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Marvel Marketing services include website design and development, website maintenance, search engine optimization, public relations services, and social media management, amongst others. To find out more, visit marvelmarketing.ca. This episode of Guess That Record is brought to you by Guitarworks. One of Canada's top independent music stores for over 30 years, Guitarworks carries a huge selection of musical instruments from the biggest brands in music, including Gibson, Fender, Martin, Yamaha, and Paul Reed Smith. Visit any of their 3 Calgary locations or shop online at guitarworks.ca and join the Guitar Perks program to earn money back with every purchase. Guitarworks, your total guitar store. This episode of Guess That Record is also brought to you by Recordland, home to the largest selection of music in Canada. Buy, sell, and trade tapes, CDs, and vinyl. Located in Calgary's Inglewood neighborhood on 9th Avenue Southeast, visit them in person or on Instagram at Recordland Calgary. And now, moving ahead a couple of years, we've got this shot here of Elton
Yes.
John, which this was used as the cover for his Greatest Hits 2 album.
Yes.
So How did you get the job with Elton
Oh
there?
well, that was because so that was designed. I mean, that's a conceptual cover, if you like the use of that word. It's a conceptual cover, and it was created by myself and a dear friend, a designer called David Costa, who worked closely with Elton and Rocket Records. And David asked me to do the photography, and we were hoping that we would make a series of greatest hits covers, and they would all be sporting bloopers, sporting mistakes, and they would all be Elton in unlikely sporting situations getting things wrong. So ripping the bays with a snooker cue or whatever, and being oblivious to whatever was going on. But we only did the cricket one. So it was very jokey. I mean, the imagery was very jokey. The music, of course, was very serious. But yeah, and we did it. We did Elton in my studio with the wicket, and then we painted the background on glass and photographed that separately, and then comped the two together.
Hmm. And I did sort of notice, like, as your career progresses, of course, and you were talking earlier about how you like the studio, you like the sort of more controlled environment, but it sort of seemed like you also enjoy props and sets
Oh yeah,
with your shoots. Yeah.
yes, I do. I mean, I've always liked creating props, creating sets, making props, building sets. It's always appealed to me, and but I didn't really begin that until late-ish in the '60s. It wasn't. I don't think it would have been acceptable in the '60s. I don't think the artists or the record companies would have really wanted that. But I started doing paperback book jackets, which had previously always been rather lurid illustrations. And I started working for a company in London in the latter part of the '60s called Fontana Books. And they wanted to do similarly lurid situations, corpses and semi naked women, etc., but that they would do them photographically. And so I would get a paragraph of text from the book that an editor had picked out, and I would illustrate it. And so I was doing corpses, and the budgets were very small, so I would employ all my friends as models, and I would do all the makeup myself. I became very good at doing bullet holes and knife wounds, and I went to all the prop houses, and it was a brilliant training. It was a great deal of fun, and it was a brilliant training. And then I was able, as we moved into the '70s, I was able to employ all that experience in creating situations for musicians, and I did a lot of covers like that.
I totally know what you mean about how, yeah, like, I don't know if that would have flown in the 60s, but as the years progressed, it definitely seemed to fit better for sure.
Yes,
Um,
as people started thinking conceptually about album covers, trying to create more of a visual story rather than just a photograph of the band.
mhm. Although, in the 60s, that I guess you could say it did start in the 60s with Sergeant Pepper, just, of course, probably the ultimate set
Yes, and
piece album cover.
yeah, and the Stones' Satanic Majesties. They both and they were absolutely, they were great big complicated sets, and they were sort of psychedelic illustrations in a way, weren't they? And
Yeah.
yeah, so I absolutely, you're quite right. Good
Mhm.
point.
And so moving ahead here, I've got this album here with Kate Bush. Um, and, I wanted to talk about Kate Bush because she's another artist that you've been linked with a fair amount in your career there. So, how did you start working with Kate?
That's an interesting cover because I haven't seen that before. I think that must be
Oh, really?
that must be the Canadian.
This
That must be the
it
Canadian
is the
version.
Yeah, it is the Canadian. And I went to confirm that it would have been your picture, and
No,
I
definitely
believe it
mine.
is.
Yeah.
So,
What's on the back? Show me the
mhm,
back. Oh yeah. Okay. So yes. So the I was brought in because Kate and her brother had produced an image for the original Kick Inside cover. And
mhm,
for one reason or another, nobody really liked it, but EMI Records in England went with it. But they didn't have, it wasn't really a commercially exploitable image. It wasn't an image that would lend itself to posters or to adverts or to any sort of promotion. And so they brought me in to create an image of Kate that could be used to launch that album. And that's what I did. And I created a series of portraits that were very successful and promoted the record. And then EMI America and I guess EMI Canada both said that they didn't want to use the original Kick Inside cover. And so I was asked to shoot another cover. Now, the cover you've just shown me, that's a press shot from that series of sessions that I did with Kate. But the actual American cover was Kate inside a box, a big wooden box that we built in the studio, and put her in it. And she then, kicked around inside the box. So it's very illustrative of the title. Um, but I hadn't seen that. I mean, the thing is that in those days, we're talking 78, in those days, all the record companies in all the different territories had a certain input. Japan, for instance, South America, Eastern Europe, they all did their own covers, or else, like America, they'd ask for a different cover. And
mhm,
and that's how that came about. And then I worked with Kate. I did 4 or 5 sessions with her. I then did a second album, um, which was called Lionheart, and which is a huge set in my studio. And then I did another shoot with her in '79, and then um, we stopped working together, and she went her way, and I continued on mine.
mhm. Yeah, it is interesting. Especially back in the 60s, that happened a lot, where you would have album, like a completely different, not just album cover, but track listing
Oh
between
yeah,
like America and the UK. So, that did definitely happen a lot
yeah. I
back in
mean,
those days for sure.
absolutely. I mean, my first cover for the Stones was called Out of Our Heads in the UK and December's Children in America and Canada. I think
Hmm.
it was the same in Canada. But of course, I didn't. Nobody bothered to show me what they were doing or give me copies or anything. I mean, it was just that just went on in the background, and we all went on, shooting the next job, doing the next thing.
Yeah. Now I got another album cover here that I wanted to go over with you, and it is John Entwistle, "Too Late the Hero." And so I'm a huge fan of The Who, and I think I bought this album when I was in high school. And it's really funny how, like, of course, I've seen this for a long time, but only recently learned that you did the photography for it. So, yeah, how did you work with John there?
Um, do you know? I can't remember how I got the job. I think I got the job through the record company. I mean, I was very well established through the '70s into the '80s and '90s, and people came to me and asked me to do shoots. And I'd never worked with the Who, and so when they asked me to shoot John Entwistle, and we discussed it, and I was delighted, of course. And I built that set in the studio. I was very into painted backgrounds at the time. And I wanted that sort of heroic theatrical movie type feeling, on the edge of the cliff with the sunset type feeling. And John wanted to be photographed in various different uniforms. He was a great collector of military uniforms and weapons. And I photographed him in several outfits with the intention that those pictures would be used to promote the album and to be in either inside or on the back. And I was never consulted about the montage, the collage of putting the two photographs together. I always wanted the portrait in the red suit to be a standalone cover, but John wanted this sort of ghost image of him as a historical soldier. I never really understood quite his thinking. And he was a man of few words. I don't remember having great discussions with him.
Right. Yeah, no, that I was actually going to ask you about sort of the ghost image of him in the background there, but that's interesting that was something that sort of happened outside of your control there.
Well, I
So
don't.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any control. I mean, the thing is, I control my photography, and then I deliver the photography, and I hope that the photography is so perfect, does the job so well that they don't have to, you know, screw around with it. But usually, often they did. And so I don't, it's very rare that people came back to me and said, we'd like to do this. What do you think? I just try and make my photography as good as I possibly can and hope that it stands up enough that people won't feel the need to mess around with it.
Of course. Yeah. Now, this record is one I was really excited to ask you about, and it is George Harrison, Cloud Nine. Because, I mean, the Beatles are why I got into music in the first place. And I always have been a fan of George. He was always, being a guitar player. I think I really gravitated towards him when I was a kid. So, yeah, what was it like to get to work with George on that?
Well, I knew George a bit by then. I knew him socially a bit, and I'd also done quite a lot of work for his Dark Horse Records. And this was another great project that I did with David Costa, my friend, who I'd worked with on the Elton John. And George was wonderful. I mean, he arrived at the studio. I'll step back for a second. We decided, we were told the album was going to be called Cloud Nine. We decided we were going to do it in the studio because we didn't want to take him outdoors in case there were problems with the weather or whatever. So I got some painted backgrounds that I liked, the sort of stormy, the grey stormy one, which is on the album cover, and then a beautiful blue sky with little white clouds in it, which was used for a singles cover and other promotional pictures. And the session was all booked, and George arrived, and we thought that George would probably come with 2 or 3 people. He came himself, he drove himself, he was carrying his own clothes. All that sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But it was unexpected that he should be by himself on it, under his own steam. And he was absolutely lovely. And I was shooting the whole session on the big format camera, which meant it was quite slow and cumbersome, and he was incredibly patient. And then we had lunch. I always feed people at the studio, and we had a lovely kitchen at the studio with a dining table. We had a great lunch, and he entertained us with the filthiest stories of Liverpool and the early rock and roll days in Liverpool. Terribly funny, and he was just absolutely charming and lovely, and everybody loved him and everybody enjoyed him, and he loved the pictures. He was really thrilled with the cover, and he was a joy, an absolute joy to work with.
Awesome. Yeah. And I mean, I'm always like amazed when I get to meet people who have interacted with the Beatles. So like, that's just really cool for me to hear.
Mm.
I did want to ask about that cover because I noticed one thing about it was the sunglasses he's wearing has a really strong reflection in his sunglasses. Was
Mm.
that something that was captured on camera or was it added after the
No,
fact?
it's on camera. Well, I mean, we it's supposed to be something similar to the sky behind him, that sort of stormy sky. No, we he had these mirrored glasses, and I set up another sky and photographed him from. It was quite complicated, but I don't think we had to retouch anything afterwards. We did. I mean, in those days, even then, when are we talking about? 82,
687.
86, yeah, maybe. I mean, even then, we tried to do everything in camera. We tried to avoid any post production if we could.
Hmm. And kind of related to George, I was reading around the same time that you did some work on this album here, The Traveling Wilburys.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
what
That were what we did. We didn't, unfortunately, and I always wished I'd been able to photograph the Wilburys because, I love George, I love Tom Petty, I love Roy Orbison. It's a Dylan. I mean, what a mix. But I never got the chance to photograph them. But I did. We I can't remember whether it was an album or whether it was a poster. We had to do a series of pictures that were traveling Wilburys pictures, but without the traveling Wilburys. And so we did guitar cases in a studio situation covered with different place names, like a touring setup. And we just had the guitars. And we did a couple of setups like that. And that's another David Costa. He was the art director on that.
Cool. And just before we move on from the Beatles, you also got to shoot Paul McCartney as well, right?
I did.
Yeah.
Paul was a friend back in the 60s. He was the only Beatle that I was really knew reasonably well. We got on very well. He was always very friendly. He was always very interested in everything that was going on and other people. And I was shooting a session that Mick Jagger was producing with Marianne at Decca Studios, and Paul came by, just dropped in, I think to offer some support to Marianne, who was quite fragile at that time. And one of the tracks she was doing was a Beatles track. And I think he just came along to try and boost her and to maybe do some hand claps or something. And I was there, and he was very happy, to have me photograph him. And that was the first time. That was the first time I ever photographed him. And then later on, I did the Wings over Japan pictures that were, for the tour program, the ill-fated tour program. So we did a great session with Paul and Wings, and all the programs had to be destroyed because the tour was cancelled. So that was a shame.
Yep, for sure. But no, that's still pretty cool. You got two of them on film at least, which
Yes,
is
I did. Yes,
awesome.
yes.
Yeah. Now this is a shot again, sort of late 80s that I wanted to go over because I just think it's such a cool picture. It's the Blow Up Your Video
Oh,
album cover for AC/DC. So yeah, that one definitely was an intricate set from what I understand there.
yeah. It's a set. It's not. It's not. There's no retouching involved. It's all built. So we built this huge television set and we rigged it so that what looked like flying glass, and then we got gosh, what's his name? I've suddenly gone blank on the
Angus?
Angus. And we got Angus. We didn't have any of the others there, and we got Angus to sort of charge through the set, and we had smoke, and it was a really big, complicated rig, and he was fabulous. I mean, he was fantastic. He had such energy and he had such a commitment because he had to do it about 30 times, 40 times. And he did it each time. He did it. And the only problem, as I remember, was that he had to come out, and we wanted him to come out with one hand out, like, and he kept on doing the other hand, and which meant that he shadowed his own face, and that was a problem. And it was obviously the way I'd set it up. I hadn't thought or considered what would be his anyway, but he did it, and he was superb. And it's apparently a much loved cover amongst AC/DC fans, and yeah, it was a great fun thing to do.
Yeah. Was that probably like the most complex set you ever designed for a photo, you would say?
I don't know. It was pretty complex because of the flying glass and the explosion and everything. I think I did others that were equally as complicated, but perhaps not as dramatic. There's a guy called Pat Travers, a great guitarist called Pat Travers, and I did a cover for him where he's supposed to be auditioning in a sort of archetypal agent's office, and who looks then there's two pictures, and so we built the set in the studio. We had all Pat's amps, speakers and amps, and he's playing, and he was famous for playing very loud, and this bored looking agent is sitting there with a cigar, and all the pictures of all his artists on the walls, very cliche, very typical. And then the back cover picture is just Pat walking out, giving us the thumbs up, and everything has been exploded by the volume of the music, and the guy is in disarray, his cigar is stubbed out, and all the pictures are cracked and broken and hanging from the wall. His desk lamp has exploded because of the volume. I think it was called Turn Up the Volume. I can't remember. So that was pretty complicated. No, I did I did a lot of quite complex, bizarre sets. And Kate Bush Lionheart was quite a big set, because that was supposed to be a huge attic. So these are all great fun to do.
Yeah. And then I've got this album cover that I wanted to go over, because it's another one that like I've seen for years, and then just found out recently it was you that took the photo. And it's this Phil Collins Dance Into the Light here.
Yeah.
So yeah, how did you get that one with Phil there?
Well, I knew Phil. I knew Phil for a long time. I photographed Phil's first ever band, actually, when he was 16 or something. And then I photographed him in Genesis. And then when he went solo, David Costa again and I got called to go to Switzerland to shoot, which is where Phil was living at the time, and to shoot a new portrait of him. And he wanted to get away from the black. I think he'd had a couple of covers which were big monochrome faces, very close, very direct into the lens, and he wanted to get away from that. He wanted strong color, and he didn't want to be a portrait. And so we came up with this idea of this movement, this dancing Phil, where he would be writing his name in light. And again, Phil was an actor in his younger days, and he really understands about performing. He's a great performer, and so I created this sort of incredible yellow orange light background, and we chose him. He's wearing a blue shirt, and it's very colorful, very vivid. He's out of focus and moving, so it's very fluid. And then we had to do the writing separately, but he wrote Phil Collins in using a torch, and then we added that to the picture afterwards. And I don't know whether the album was a big success or not. I never got that sort of info. But it was a lovely session, and he was a lovely man. And then we went on to work with him again on another project. We went to put together a big program for one of his tours, one of his American tours. And we did a lot of work with him in America on that.
Awesome. Yeah. And now that picture in particular, I know because a couple years ago, Phil remastered all of his albums, and he sort of recreated each album cover with
Oh,
sort of his current self in the photos. And so, of course, they did that one.
did they?
Did you have any involvement in that, or?
Never heard that before. Didn't know anything about it.
Okay, yeah. So that's I think it was 2016 when he did those remasters, and yeah, so he redid every album cover from his solo career,
Oh, really?
in the
Okay.
exact same style as each record. But yeah,
Oh well.
it I
I'm
was
not,
wondering if you did that, but
no, I didn't. I didn't. I wasn't involved. I didn't know anything about it. Never heard about it before. I'll look it up and see who he used.
okay, right. Um, Now I wanted to ask you about this because like I've actually dabbled a bit in photography myself. I went to university for journalism, so I took a ton of photography classes in when I was going to school for journalism, and of course I had to take a lot of pictures writing the stories that I was working on. But I've always, and you could probably tell that I sort of like, older music. I'm also sort of the opinion I like film. I like the look of film better. So I actually do have a Canon film camera from the early 90s that I've experimented with. And it's been interesting because I do think there's pros and cons to both film and digital. Obviously with film, you don't have the luxury of being able to delete bad photos, but I feel like that kind of forces you to, really make sure you're taking a good shot. Whereas with digital, you can shoot as much as you want. So like, yeah, where do you sort of stand on the debate of film and digital?
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I'm I'm very pragmatic about it because really, and you'll have to forgive me, but I'm not very good on actual dates. But I first started dabbling in digital post production in the mid 90s. And I did it because I was monitoring the progress of digital imaging, and it just was not viable at all. The first cameras, you had to make three exposures, so you couldn't photograph people. Um, it was cumbersome, and it definitely wasn't happening. But it was going to happen. But in the meantime, post production, the ability to correct color, to retouch, all of that stuff was becoming increasingly viable. And I started doing my own post production, partly because it was a commercial thing. It was a way of getting an extra fee, but it was also a way of controlling the final result a little bit more rather than handing it over to to a lab. And as I was doing that, I was still shooting film, but we were scanning the film in and then working on the scan. And that was a learning curve, and it was very interesting. And I learned a great deal. And I did quite a lot of work using that system, shooting film, scanning in, producing a digital output. And then digital cameras became viable. Again, I'm not sure quite when, but in the early 2000s, I guess. And clients began to demand that we shoot digital because they thought it was going to be cheaper. And they thought that they're not going to have film and processing to pay for. and that it's going to be cheaper. And what nobody initially appreciated was how much post-production you had to do with digital, particularly if you were shooting commercially and you were shooting raw files. There was a lot of work to be done. And that so there was this sort of curious crossover period when there was a lot of resistance from older established photographers about making the transition. There was a lot of pressure from the clients to shoot digitally. And so I went with the flow, but I was very lucky because my commercial photographic career was beginning to run out of steam, but interest in my archive was increasing. And so as the complexity of the technology began to take over and intrude, I began to reduce the amount of commercial photography and focus on my archive. And it was much more fun for me. My commercial photography I wasn't enjoying it nearly as much. And I've never been particularly technological. And with digital, the technology is very intrusive. You've got a computer with a lens, and it's very intrusive. And when you shoot in the studio, everybody expects you to have a huge monitor and for every exposure to flash up on the monitor, and then everybody rushes and everybody looks at their own little bit. The makeup person looks at the makeup, and the stylist looks at the clothes. The photographer just, can hardly get a look in. And I hate all that,
Mhm.
I hate it. So I'm pragmatic about it. I have a Hasselblad X1D50 or whatever it's called, medium format digital camera, and I shoot on that when I need to shoot. But my feelings about it are just pragmatic. Times change. You have to move with the times. And I'm not sure whether I don't know whether I feel nostalgic for film because I'm working with film all the time. I'm working with my archive, which is all film.
Mhm.
What I don't like particularly is I see an awful lot of digital photography which looks almost like hyper-realist illustration. And I don't like that. I don't like that sort of super finish that a lot of digital photography has. But at the same time, I love the post-production capabilities and potential of it. So I'm, as I say, I'm very pragmatic and practical about it.
Now, we're going to be entering the guessing portion of this podcast.
Okay.
So I'll go over the rules for you, Gered, and any new listeners out there.
Okay.
Inside this bag that I'm holding here is a record from my collection. I'll give you 3 clues about this album, and then
Okay.
you ask me 20 questions to determine its identity. And if you get stuck, I'll give you plenty of hints.
Okay.
I don't think it'll be too hard.
All right.
So, yeah, Gered Mankowitz, are you ready to guess that record?
Yes, I am.
All right. Here are your 3 clues. This album was released in the 1960s. It was one of the best-selling albums of the 60s, and you've taken photos of this artist. Question 1.
Okay. Is it a cover that I've shot?
No. Question 2.
Okay. Is the cover color or black and white?
It's color. Question 3.
Is it an all-male band
Yes. Question 4.
with 4 people?
Yes. Question 5.
Okay. So I'll hazard a guess that it might be the Beatles.
It's not the Beatles,
Okay.
but these guys kind of, I think a lot of people would say they sort of passed or the Beatles. Once they ended, these guys became the next big thing. Question 6.
Oh, okay. Are they English or American?
They are English. Question 7.
All right. So, is Jimmy Page one of the people in the band?
He is. Question 8.
So, is it Led Zeppelin?
It is Led Zeppelin. Question 9.
And is it, now I don't know the names of a single Led Zeppelin album, so is it the one with the little girl crawling up to the monolith?
No.
I don't
It
know.
was it's I can, you've got Led Zeppelin, so I could just show you the album if you're
Okay, show me the
ready
album.
for it.
It's a graph. I think.
All right, it was Led Zeppelin 2. Led Zeppelin 2 was the album. Yes. So
Well,
I thought it would be great to because you've done some Zeppelin, you've done some Yardbirds, so I thought that would be a great record to sort of also tie into your career as well.
it's pretty good. I think I did pretty well considering.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, that was funny. Yeah. So I'd known Jimmy Page for quite a while. I knew him when he was a session musician, and he's a friend of mine still. Yeah. I only photographed Led Zeppelin the once, and yeah. Good. Good fun. Thank you so much.
Well,
I enjoyed that.
Yeah. So before we sort of move into the discussion of all that, I'll just share a few facts about the album for those unfamiliar with it. Led Zeppelin 2 is the second album by Led Zeppelin. It was released in October of 1969, and recording for the record took place over the course of 1969 in several locations while the band was on tour in the US and UK. It was their first album to reach number one in both America and England, and is currently the sixth best-selling album of the 1960s, with 15 million copies sold worldwide. So, big seller there. And now I wanted to, as I mentioned there, you worked with the Yardbirds, and this is sort of the well-known shot of the Yardbirds that you took there, the five of them standing in the street there.
Yeah, indeed.
So how did you sort of meet up with them and take that shot?
Well, let me try and remember who managed them. I can't remember. It was just, in the 60s, I just did a lot of sessions with different bands. They were coming at me left, right, and center. The Yardbirds came to me. I can't remember who were managing them at the time. Was it Simon Napier Bell, or was it? I really can't remember. But they came to me, and we did a big shoot in the studio and outside the studio. And that particular picture, because I'd known Jimmy Page, that meant there was the relationship between me and the band was good because Jimmy knew me and they all knew of me because of the work I'd done with the Stones. So it was a very easygoing shoot, and we were outside the studio in this place called Ormond Yard, and I got them in this sort of the classic V formation with the singer in the front, which is one of the sort of formats that compositions that you try and adopt with a band of five people, and they went straight into it. And as we were working, I saw out of the corner of my eye this guy walking through the background wearing a bowler hat. And now in those days there were a lot of bowler hats to be seen. City gents, businessmen, a lot of them wore bowler hats, and it seemed great moment, and I managed to get that one frame where he's actually framed between Keith Relf's legs, and it just sort of caught this moment of the sort of rebellious youth with the framing the establishment figure in the bowler hat. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, that was that.
That's that's the beauty of photography, is how sometimes, you'll get like little things like that that just make the picture.
Yeah.
Um, and then with Led Zeppelin, this is the photo, or one of the photos you took of Led Zeppelin. And the interesting thing is that, we spoke about how you don't often take, live shots, but there obviously it was some performance shots of Led Zeppelin that you took
Indeed,
there, which is
indeed.
mhm,
I was the photographer on a big television show called Super Session or Super Show. I think it's gone out as under both names. And it was a mad idea where somebody had decided that by bringing together a lot of wonderful musicians from different genres. So there was the modern jazz quartet was there, Eric Clapton and Blind Faith were there. Not Blind Faith. Sorry, who were
Cream.
Cream? So thank you so much. Sorry. So
Mhm.
Cream were there. Led Zeppelin were there. Buddy Guy was there. Buddy Miles was there. Stephen Stills was there. Blah, 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 blah. Lots and lots of people. And then the producers thought that all these people would play together and make great music. And of course, it doesn't work like that. And so I think musically, the show was pretty much a disaster. But interestingly, as far as I can remember, it's a long time ago, Led Zeppelin were the only people who refused to jam with anyone else. They did
Mhm.
they did their bit. I don't know how many numbers they did, and that's when I photographed them. And they didn't jam. And the same series, because the thing was filmed over about 4 or 5 days. I got a lot of other pictures. I got some lovely portraits of Buddy Guy. I got some great pictures of Buddy Miles, beautiful portraits of Eric Clapton, Stephen Stills, Jack Bruce, etc., etc. So it was it was one of those very rare occasions. I said to you earlier that I only did live after the Stones tour for special events, live albums, or this particular event, and that's how I came to know
Mhm.
supplement. Yeah.
Right. And that's another sort of rare shot to get Zeppelin in a TV studio, because they also, they did a few TV appearances sort of around that time, like, which they were still pretty new, but then they were like, we're not going on TV anymore, which was
Ah,
kind of rare for a big band at that point, to sort of have the confidence to be able to say no to TV. So yeah, they now to talk about the album, this one is an interesting record because I think it's the one where they kind of found their sound in a way. Jimmy Page, of course, this was the first record where he used his famous Les Paul, which I've actually seen that specific guitar in a museum before. But I was kind of curious because since you were actually around at the time, one thing I've sort of seen is that like contemporary reactions to Led Zeppelin could be mixed. They definitely had their supporters, but there also seemed to be a lot of people that were, just not for them in any way. So, what was your reaction to them? When they first sort of hit the scene.
it was indifference, really. It did. They didn't really do very much for me. I mean, uh, yeah, they didn't. They didn't particularly move me. I recognized that they were extraordinarily good at what they did, but they didn't really appeal to me particularly. And it was, I'm always interested in my friends and acquaintances and what they're doing. So obviously I had interest in Jimmy and how his career was going, if you like. But apart from that, it didn't really do very much for me. Single individual tracks worked perhaps for me, but otherwise I wasn't really very into them, and I don't recall my contemporaries. I don't recall their responses to them. I think we were much more into soul and R&B and reggae than heavy. I don't even know how you describe progressive rock. I don't know how you describe Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, it's their own thing, that's for sure.
That's their own.
I did want to ask about the album cover because photography wise, it's quite interesting. I'll put it up there on screen, but they took a shot of some World War One fighter pilots,
Yeah,
and then kind of like put the band's heads over top of some of the pilots
yeah,
there.
yeah.
So like very early Photoshop in a way, but like how would you have done something like that back then?
Well, if you look at it, you'll see it's very out of focus. So I mean, they would have just taken the photograph. They would literally just cut out the photographs and stick them together and photograph them again. It was very crude, but very straightforward. They'd create a physical piece of artwork. I mean, that was a physical. I don't know. Can you look at the back and tell me who was the designer? Does it say?
Let's see here. It says that the artwork was done by David Juniper.
Hmm.
So I'm
Yeah.
not sure I've heard of that. I
No.
know Led Zeppelin, a few of their album covers were done by Hypnosis,
Yeah.
the guys that did all the Pink Floyd
Yeah.
albums.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, I mean, in those days, that sort of thing would be done with literally colored card, cutout shapes, graphic drawings, old photographs stuck together, and then it would be rephotographed,
Mhm.
and possibly then retouched again on the negative or the transparency. Various stages that it went through. Yeah,
Right.
pretty
Um,
crude.
yeah. And just to end off on it all, I know you mentioned you're friends with Jimmy, and it was funny because I saw on your Instagram that you were at some Gibson event recently with Jimmy. Is that right?
Yeah, I was. Well, Gibson Guitars have opened Gibson Guitars garage in London. It's the first one out of America, and it's the most extraordinary place that they've created. And in that process of creating it, they made a gallery and the Gibson Garage Gallery. And I'm the first photographer to be exhibited there. And I've got about 40 pictures there on show for the next 6 months. And at the opening, which I think was about 4 weeks ago, Jimmy and Brian May and Tommy Iommi and a couple of other people were there, and I was there, and managed to say hello to Jimmy and have a hug. And it was lovely. It was a great event. And then the next day I did a talk there with my friend P.P. Arnold, the great soul singer, as my special guest. So yeah, I'm quite closely involved with what's going on there because, as I say, because my photographs are on display and will be for 6 months.
All right. Well, we have reached the end of the interview. I want to thank Gered Mankowitz for taking the time to come on the show. Like I said, it's great to have probably one of the most successful music photographers on this show. It was a real treat to break down your photos and hear these amazing stories. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Absolute pleasure, Jackson. Thanks so much for asking me. I'm really pleased to have been your guest.
For sure. And I guess just before we wrap up, where can the people find your stuff online? And do you have any new projects that you're working on and want to share?
Thank you. So there's the exhibition at the Gibson Garage in London, and I have a new book, a new Rolling Stones book, which is just being published and will be published in America and Canada next week, I think. called The Rolling Stones Rare and Unseen, which I'm very excited about, and which will be available at all good bookshops as well as online retailers. So that's exciting. And yeah, I think that's probably all I've got to offer you in terms of what I'm currently doing.
And you're on Instagram and
Oh,
all
I'm
the
sorry. Yeah,
socials.
yeah, absolutely. I'm on Instagram. I'm on X. I'm on Facebook. And I'm also on, my own website, mankowitz.com, um, which has hundreds of my photographs on it and lots of information. And um, yeah, so people can go there, follow me on Instagram. Yes, follow me on Instagram. That would be great.
Absolutely. Yeah. As always, thanks to you, the listeners. The podcast is nothing without you checking out the episodes, so your support is greatly appreciated. Make sure to leave a 5-star review wherever you listen, and tell your friends to check us out. If you'd like to hear the music discussed on the show, head on over to Spotify to check out the Music of Guess That Record playlist, which is updated after each new episode. Make sure as well to subscribe to our YouTube channel to see the video versions of these incredible interviews. Lastly, you can follow us on Instagram at Guess That Record. Remember to keep rocking, and we'll see you on the next episode of Guess That Record.